Bonjour et bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Nous sommes heureux de vous accueillir à la dernière session de la série Boîte et outils en sciences humaines numériques. Je suis Jada Watson, coordonnatrice des sciences humaines numériques à l'Université d'Ottawa. Good morning and welcome to the final session of the DH Toolbox series for the fall semester. I'm Jada Watson, coordinator of DH at the University of Ottawa, and I'm delighted to be bringing the 5th season of DH Toolbox workshops to you. In today's workshop, we're honored to host our DH friend, Dr. Jennifer Guiliano from Indiana University. Before we begin today, I'd like to start a session with an Indigenous land affirmation. Nous rendons hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date, l'unissant à ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Nous reconnaissons les gardiens des savoirs traditionnels jeunes et âgés. Nous honorons aussi leurs courageux dirigeants d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. In our final session today, we're going to learn how project development or project management can save our sanity. We'll learn about project management through the lens of managing our own projects and managing projects collaboratively. Exploring resources from devdh.org, Dr. Jennifer Guiliano will share strategies for organizing your project, developing collaborations, and managing your daily and long-term project goals. I'm really delighted to introduce our final speaker for the semester, who's Dr. Jennifer Guiliano, a white academic living and working on the lands of the Miami Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, Wea, and Shawnee peoples. She currently holds a position as Associate Professor in the Department of History and affiliated faculty in both Native American and Indigenous Studies and American Studies at IUPUI in Indianapolis, Indiana. She's the author of Primer for Teaching Digital History, forthcoming in 2022, and a co-author of the volume DH Workshops with Dr. Laura Estel, who delivered a workshop for us last year. That will be coming out in 2023. I'm really excited for us to have this last session today on managing workshops. It's a nice cap off to everything we've discussed this term. I'm going to be throwing some links in the chat momentarily so that you can access slides and the Padlet. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat or use the Q&A. I will be monitoring that and bringing questions to our speaker as they arise. Without further ado, I turn the slide over, or the screen over, to Dr. Jennifer Guiliano.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jada, for organizing this. It's nice to return a little bit to my roots. I've spent 15 years now managing projects at universities, including the University of Illinois, the University of South Carolina, the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities. And I do a lot of consulting work for people on establishing projects and sort of thinking through how things are going. This first slide you're looking at includes 2 links, as Jada mentioned, one to the Padlet where there's some Q&A we're going to be doing, and the other to the slides. I've got a lot of slides and we're going to kind of move rapidly, but I'm going to try and leave plenty of time at the end so that we can talk about issues or problems or scenarios that you're running into when you think about projects and project management. I really would like this to be sort of organic and flexible. And apparently I don't want to click. There we go. Okay, so I want to start with the sort of notion of what a project is. When I talk about projects and project management, I like to use a really large and sort of expansive definition. For me, it's a sequence of related activities. It's derived from a question, an issue, or a problem. It requires the use or development of resources. It has some sort of audience and or partners involved, and it results in a product. So for my purposes, you know, a project can really be anything from an event, a meeting, a conference, a workshop, a symposium, to things like your dissertation, an article, It could be everything from, building an exhibit or a web app to, trying to just spend time mapping out a career. Sometimes when we think about projects, oftentimes we think about them as being sort of these really grand and giant things. And part of what I'm going to talk to you guys about today is the importance of thinking about projects as sort of intermediate stages or groups of stages that have milestones, that have things we do that allow us to sort of manage our time and manage our own investment in sort of what is going on. And importantly, we want to start with this notion that managing a project is actually about managing people, including yourself, more than it's about managing the project. So, a lot of times when we talk about project management, we're talking about things like timelines and milestones and due dates and assignments, and all of those things are really important, but those things only exist because of the people that are involved in the project. And part of the struggle of being part of a project is that you're not just managing everyone around you, you're also managing yourself. And we have lots of demands on our time, particularly during COVID. We all have personal and professional things that are going on. And so part of what today's presentation is going to do for you is talk a little bit about different strategies you can use to manage not just the milestones and the timelines and the assignments, but also the people around you, including yourself. So we're going to start with a nice little Padlet. What values, this is question 2, should we encourage when we manage a project? And you can respond either here in the Padlet or you can respond in the chat, which I'll pull up as well. Transparency. Transparency is a great one. Equity, diversity, and inclusion. That's a great value. What other values might we include? Accessibility, right. Accessibility can be multiple things. It could be accessibility in terms of what we're building and designing, but it also can be accessibility in terms of access to the resources and the project team, and even the materials, the raw materials that we're using for the project. Sustainability, that's always a big one for a project. Thinking about how is this thing going to be made available in 2, 4, 6, 10, 15, 20 years. Trust. Trust is also something that's really important, as is efficiency. When we think about efficiency in particular, how do we measure efficiency? How much time are we spending? Do we know how much time we should be spending? One of the things that I like to talk to people about is, do you know how much your time costs? So if you're having a meeting with 10 people that lasts an hour, that meeting doesn't cost $100. It may cost $1,200 or $12,000, depending on how many people are in the room and the amount of time that they're spending. Teamwork. Teamwork goes along with trust, right? Wanting to think about how do we engage with each other in a way that's positive and rewarding, and that's in showing investment in each other. And inclusion, right? Inclusion in terms of not just, who's in the room, but who can't even be in the room because of how we're organizing a project, right? So one of the big conversation points in project management throughout COVID has been, what does it mean that we've moved to remote work? For a lot of people, that's been incredible because we've opened up the door to participation from people who can't leave their homes or who have personal caregiving issues. But it also means that you have to figure out how to deal with talking to a screen all day long. And what does that mean? Thrift. Money is a huge question when it comes to projects. What do you do if you have money? And what do you do if you don't have any money? And oftentimes in digital humanities, it feels like we spend a lot of time talking about money, getting money, how do we keep money, how do we keep earning money? And yet the question of, is this actually worth our money is one that's sort of important to start with. And openness. And I think openness goes really well with teamwork and trust. And we're going to talk about that at the end of this presentation. What do you do when things aren't going well and you might need to talk about that with people? How do you raise concerns or questions or issues? So we're going to go back to our presentation. So one of the first strategies that we talk about in project management are charters, agreements, and handshakes. So this probably is a familiar concept to you. It's the notion that you need to put a project in writing. And so part of the starting point for this is that projects can be as simple as one person with a list of what you're going to try and do and a set of goals. Even bullet points can be a project list, but that the more people you have involved in the project, the more you need to put things in writing. And one of the things that I like to say to people, it isn't that people are mean or malicious or even forgetful. It's just that we're all busy. So how many times have you gotten an email where you've forgotten to put that assignment in your calendar, or you've gotten a reminder from someone that says, hey, you forgot to do this thing and it's now overdue. It's not that you meant to forget, it's just that you're really busy and you kind of need to know what you're responsible for and when, those things are due. And so oftentimes, part of the purpose of putting things in writing is to make sure not only we don't forget what we're doing, but also so that we're all on the same page. And part of that's because if it's in writing, you can't ignore it. If it's in writing, other people can't avoid it. And if it's in writing, there's this hypothetical playing field where everyone is equal, right? You've agreed to do this piece. I've agreed to do that piece. We've settled on our responsibilities and we can go about our day and do our work. The problem with this is that for that sort of writing agreement to happen, you really need to sit down and agree what our values are, what our goals are, and the types of products that we want to come to. So there's two examples here on the screen that are two of my favorite. One is from the Praxis program at Scholars Lab at UVA. This is the charter that their students do every year when they develop their projects as a class of cohort of fellows. And the other one is the Links project, which is here in Canada. Hopefully you guys are familiar with it. They have this fabulous project charter that says, not just what are our values and how are we going to do the work together, but what are the types of things that we're trying to achieve and how do we work together to achieve those goals? So there's a couple of rules that go with sort of writing down these agreements. Oftentimes, this is the type of documentation that includes things like citations and attributions. How do we publish our material? Who gets credit? How do we talk to one another? So sometimes project charters can say things like, I've got an agreement that you need to respond to emails within 48 hours or 72 hours, or, this project's going to collaborate via Slack, and it's expected that, during the workday you have Slack open and that you respond to it. Project charters can also include things like, what roles people have and who's responsible for what. So, I am the person responsible for ensuring that all of our press releases are done and that they're released on Fridays, or I am the person that's responsible for, drafting our logos, or I'm the person responsible for building this section of code, or oftentimes roles and responsibilities in projects aren't just, what are we building together, but it's also a way to hold yourself accountable. So if you're thinking about, for example, roles and responsibilities of a project like your thesis or your dissertation or an article, oftentimes that roles and responsibilities section is a way to talk to your faculty members, your advisor, about the type of advice you might want from them. So in my role as your advisor, I will give you feedback within 2 weeks. I will try and offer you positive feedback. I will include, where possible, pointers to potential publication outlets. I'll make sure to guide you in a way that this is something that could be, a book, or it could be something that could move in the future towards more collaborations. Part of what's great about project charters is it also spells out appropriate behaviors. So a lot of times when we think about charters, it's a lot of sort of rigid and formulaic kind of things, like, when you do something, when it's due, what needs to be done. But it can also be things like, it's expected that emails include, hi, how are you? It can talk about collegiality and cordiality, right? It could be things like, you can't just ghost us, you can't disappear, or if you disappear for more than 3 months on a project, we have the right to replace you as a person on our project. So part of why we like charters is that, they really do allow for those very important discussions between people to happen at the start of a project before it's really gotten moving. This way you can highlight any place that you guys might disagree. So does merely being on the project team get you credit for a publication, or do you actually have to do some writing? Do you actually have to do some of the work of the team before you can receive credit for your curriculum vitae? And it can also include some line items, things like how do we license this project? What credits are there? It can outline things like, what partnerships we have, what our preservation strategy is. And one that's really important to me is what access do you have to the products of the project after you leave, right? So maybe you've gathered and built a massive data set and you graduate or you take a new job. Do you have the right to take that data with you? And that's why these charters are sort of really important, is it's not just about maintaining the project, as it is when it starts, but it's about what might happen in 5 years. As a member of the project team allowed to just take the project and spin it off in a whole new direction without discussing it with anyone. And that's why charters are sort of, really useful to people. And they can include some really good agreements, things like who has access to what resources, how much computational time do you get for free? How many hours of access to a graphic designer? How many hours of project development time do you get? How much time do you get with a business person who consults with you? And it can do things like outline access, right? So things like, attribution, access, long-term strategies. And importantly, agreements don't always have to be sort of part of the charter, right? So maybe you're halfway through a project and you realize you need a new partner. You can bring that partner on as an agreement and not necessarily change the entire charter as a whole. So there's a couple of common types of agreements. These can be limited term. So this is something we just need access to for a while. I like limited term agreements for things like events, right? Like just for 3 months, you're going to give us access to your business people or your space or your sort of resources. They can also be hidden agreements. So these are things like your dean or your chair might say to you, listen, we'll give you a course release or we'll give you some extra money here or there. Those are things that might not necessarily be part of a charter, but you definitely want in writing so that you can make sure that you're held accountable. One of my favorite examples of this is a university where the administration turned over in the middle of a project. And because we had these things in writing, we were able to hold the new administration to those agreements by saying, we have this in writing. This isn't just, something small. But agreements can also be inside of a project, not necessarily about the overstructure, but about the day-to-day. So you as a project manager could have an agreement with a staff member, hey, if you do X, we'll give you time to do Y. And I use these a lot in really big projects where we have lots and lots of things going on. Maybe you need extra time to do, time off, or you need extra time to work on something that's your personal research. I might say to you, listen, I understand you really want to work on that thing. What if we spend X amount of hours doing this thing first, and then you can go do entirely what you need to do for these other hours, and that would be okay with me. So the benefits, everybody's on the same page. We have really good conversations, and it can also allow an opportunity to clear up grievances, right? So our charter might say, what do we do if we have a problem? So who do you talk to? What do you do? Does it need to be in writing? Do you get to just complain at the coffee shop, about what's going on? Or do we actually have a process for airing concerns? And importantly, what I like about this strategy is, it really does depend on the entire team. Everybody's in agreement, everybody's part of it, and everybody has to uphold the terms. So it's not just one person wandering around holding everybody responsible for things. And oftentimes in project management, you feel like you're the person making the gears move or making the trains run on time. And so project charters are really good ways to have a little bit of oomph behind you holding people accountable, sitting down and saying, we all agreed to this. So if it's not working, let's talk about why it's not working. There are a couple of cons though. Obviously agreements and charters don't address issues of inequality and status directly. It's really hard to codify what do you do as a junior person in a charter when the person who's in charge of the project isn't holding up their end of the deal. And so a lot of times what you see is projects start with charters or agreements, but how the project actually works isn't holding up those values. And that's part of the reason why I like both Links and the Praxis project. They spend a lot of time checking in on their charter and making sure that the way the project works every day is with their charter. And importantly, the other thing is, obviously, if you're going to be doing this long term, you do have to update charters and agreements regularly to make sure that it reflects what you're doing in your day-to-day. One of the other small things that I think is really important, trust is irreplaceable in a project. And this is one of the values that you guys identified in the Padlet. When you trust someone in place, that you trust someone you're working with, it's really easy to work with them again. And because you trust them, they can earn some leeway. And this is what I call the frequent collaborator discount. So I'm in a project right now where I've got some stuff going on personally. And I texted the person and said, listen, I'm so sorry. I'm going to blow this deadline. Like I'm distracted. I'm not going to be able to get to this. And their response was, hey, it's no big deal. We've got time built in. You do what you need to do. I'll take care of what we're doing right now, and we'll trade off. And Laura Still, who Jada mentioned earlier today, during the Digital Humanities 2020 conference process, when we were managing that was something we did a lot as co-directors of the program, was trading off who was responsible so that we could make time for things going on personally and professionally. And that made a huge difference. And because of that experience together, we're now editing a book together. We've written a bunch of articles together. The frequent collaborator discount is really about building long-term relationships. And that kind of trust is irreplaceable. So part of the reason why trust matters so much is I think you've got to be wary of what are called handshake agreements. These are agreements where somebody comes to you and says they want to be part of a project, but they're not actually amenable to signing anything. So sometimes these are things like, I want to be part of this, but I really don't have the time or the money, but I think it's really important. How about I just, show up to the meeting, but not really do any work? You really want to be sure when you're thinking of adding people to a project where they may not be comfortable signing a charter, or they don't really want their name on the day-to-day work. They only want their name on sort of the project at large, that you know what you're getting in return for that. And we see this a lot in digital humanities, unfortunately, with people who are very senior who decide that they want to become digital humanists, but they don't really want to learn digital humanities. And so a lot of times they become big names on projects and are presenting and writing articles, but they're not really involved in the day-to-day. And so I encourage you to be wary of those types of untested partners who aren't sort of part of the day-to-day. I think it makes it really difficult to hold everybody on the project team accountable when you have that type of inequity occurring in a project. And you want to be sure that if your project requires or relies on a handshake deal, like with your chair or your dean, that if that deal falls apart, the project can recover. So I was on a project once where I had somebody who committed some money and said, we'll totally give you this money and you can go do what you want to do to build this thing. And then 6 weeks later, after we'd started the project and hired somebody on, they came back and said, well, our budget changed and we don't have that money anymore. And so I had to figure out, how do we fund this student to do the work that they, had already done. And that's why I really encourage you to sort of get things in writing as much as possible, or to have a fallback plan if things disappear. And the other side of this coin is, know when to use a handshake to avoid bureaucracy. Universities are giant machines, and sometimes it's faster just to go ask for something or ask for a favor and say, I'll trade you X if you give me Y. And this way, then we don't have to negotiate officially with everyone else involved. So I do this a lot with people where I will do consultation for their individual research projects. And in exchange, I'll get back things like them working with me on an article or editing something for me or doing some programming work, right? So knowing who's around you that you may be able to barter with for resources or for support can be a very useful strategy in managing your project. So let's talk about what skills are needed for project management. So if you want to split back to your Padlet, what types of skills do you think you might need for effective project management? Empathy. Empathy is a great one. You know, and when we talk about empathy, we have to think about it not just in terms of emotional feelings, but also things about like, what language am I using when I talk to people? What words am I choosing to use? And how are other people hearing those words? I was telling Jada earlier, you know, I tend to be a cranky kind of person. And sometimes I forget that my tone of voice can really change how people perceive what I'm saying to them. So sometimes for me, being empathetic is not just understanding where the other person is coming from, but thinking about how they're perceiving where I'm coming from. Time management. Oh my heavens, time management is so important. You know, not just how much time something takes, but what happens when time spins out of control. I was saying to people on Twitter yesterday, I had absolutely no focus, and I sat down and 5 hours later, I was still working on the same thing. And it was like all of my time management skills just disappeared into a black hole, and I had nothing to show for it. So, you know, how do we hold ourselves accountable when it comes to time management? And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Realistic goals. We're going to talk a little bit about what's called scope creep. What happens when you have a grand plan and grand goals, but you actually can't kind of get there? You know, what do we do when your hopes and dreams for something just don't quite mature? Communication. Communication's a big one. And I talked about that a little bit with empathy. You know, how do we talk to the people around us, but also, you know, how do we be vulnerable in how we communicate with people? You know, how do we be honest about what's going on in a project? And that comes with the social skills question. One of the hardest things in project management is thinking about, you know, how we relate to one another. You know, what do we do if someone isn't a good communicator? What do we do if someone is having a bad day? What do we do if our personalities just don't click? I've had that on projects before where, you know, my personality tends to be relatively not abrupt, but very direct. And sometimes that can be really off-putting to people where, you know, they're not quite sure how to approach me, and I can seem distant or, you know, a little mean sometimes. You know, so how do we think about our social skills, and how do we think about, you know, improving the communication? Being flexible. Flexibility can be hard in a project because projects are all about rules and regulations and deadlines. How do we build flexibility into a project? You know, if you've got something that's due, what do you do when that's not, you're not going to get there? Or what do you do when you finished a project 3 months early? How do you adjust what you're doing? So we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Flexibility goes with the being able to say no. Sometimes being flexible means you have to say no to someone. So what are your priorities, and how do you think about your priorities, not just for the project as a whole, but for you as an individual? And that's that sense of consensus that's important for a project. You know, importantly, when we talk about project management, digital humanities, we often develop consensus when we write a grant or when we develop a project charter. But for projects that last over months and even years, that sense of consensus can really dissolve or change in the face of challenges around the day-to-day environment of your life and your project. So, you know, how do we think about checking in with one another to make sure we're still working towards the same goal, and we're still working towards, you know, something collectively and collaboratively that we find value in? And that goes back to that question of realistic goals, right? You know, what is a goal that's doable in the time that we have with the skills that we have? And documenting decisions and reasoning for the decision somehow. Documentation is like the third rail of digital humanities. And by that, I mean, there's never enough time to document. And yet documentation is really the only way you know how you got to where you were going. And that becomes really important, not just for the future of, you know, the project as a whole. You want to be able to go back and determine, you know, why did we choose to use this type of programming language or this technology or this metadata schema? but also because that becomes raw material for future stages of the project. So, I mentioned the Digital Humanities 2020 project that Laura Still and I were doing. One of the things that we did was, as we worked through the project, we wrote a bunch of blog posts that outlined our logic and our reasoning, why we chose open peer review, how we built the ontology. All of those documented decisions of why we did what we did became fodder for a series of articles that we've since written. And that's one of those things that when you think about effective project management, it's not just we've got to get to our goal, it's that we need to get to our goal in a way that we can go back and reconstruct what happened. And we'll talk about that in a moment when we talk about backward design. So, as an individual, what skills do you need? When I talk to people about project management as an individual, like when you're thinking about building your own DH project, writing your own article, working on your own thesis, as an individual, you know that you need to build out your project when you've reached the limits of what you can do on your own. This can be technically, I don't have the programming skills. It can be infrastructurally, I need time off, so I need somebody to come in and teach my class, or I need money from a funder because I need somebody who can do, metadata schema in a way that I don't know how to do. But it can also be intellectual, right? So oftentimes when you're working on a project by yourself, you need intellectual sounding boards. You need collaborators who can look at what you're doing and give you feedback. And for students in particular, that first collaborator is often your faculty member. It's often your advisor. And so, when I mentor students through their thesis and their dissertation, one of the things that I say to them is, you're not doing this on your own. You have a set of interlocutors. You have me, you have your other readers, and you have all of these people that you're relying on in the secondary source literature that you're in conversation with. So have a conversation. Don't work by yourself in a vacuum. That doesn't really help a project, right? Because you need feedback. So what happens when you bring on these people, when you think about skills? You want to sit down and think about, what are they going to contribute? Specifically, this person contributes that they are really good at this programming thing. They're a graphic designer. They're a teacher and can build pedagogy. They're, a brilliant speaker and would be great at doing, publicity materials or building talks. You want to sort of have a clear statement of what that person or that project, how those two things come together, right? So I'm somebody who is incredibly good at time management. It's one of those hangovers from being a military kid. And so a lot of times when I'm working on projects, when we talk about what I'm going to contribute, a lot of times the first thing on my list of what I can contribute is, I can keep us on time. I can start a meeting and end the meeting and make sure we're all there on time. We get our things done. I can keep the train moving. Importantly, when you think about this, you want to think about your pattern of engagement and their pattern of engagement. And what I mean by that is, are we going to meet daily? Are we going to meet weekly? Are we going to meet monthly? Am I somebody that needs to talk to you, frequently? Or am I somebody that can go away for a month and come back and deliver what I need to deliver? And this is the part of setting up a project and a project management strategy that's really important, is to actually have a conversation with each other about, how do you like to work in the day-to-day? So for example, I'm a night person. I normally start my day around 10 o'clock in the morning. And I will go until 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night most days, with a nice break in the middle for a nap, because I like my nap time. That's in contrast to colleagues who, because they have other obligations, are working at 5 in the morning and like to work from 5 in the morning till 1 in the afternoon. So part of your conversation of project management is not just, what are you going to give, but how do you like to be talked to? When do you like to be talked to? One of my favorite negotiation points on a project always is, are we going to honor holidays and nights and weekends? And for your own mental health, I always encourage that, as much as you can, honor vacation time, honor time off. It helps everyone to come back to a project after they've been away and to sort of have that breathing room. So you want to sort of identify and work with each other to know, like, when do you want to be working? And this is really important, particularly in COVID times, because it feels like people are working around the clock all the time. And so you really want to be honest with each other about what your availability is and when you're not available. So with this in mind, you can have all types of partnerships in your project. You can have one-time partner, somebody who comes in once or twice, they do what they need to do and they go. So the amount of work you may do with them, is minimal and you're good. You can have quarterly or monthly partners, people you check in with regularly, but who aren't invested in the day-to-day. Versus those sort of daily or embedded partners, right? People that you talk to all the time, who are up to speed on everything, who get CC'd on all the emails. Those are very different than those one-time partners. And one of the principles that I like to talk to people about is that the value and density of someone's contribution is equal to their project authority. And this goes back to that, what do you do when you have someone who just wants their name on a project? If you're only going to be here for 5 minutes versus 5 hours, you probably don't have the same level of project authority in our conversations and in our negotiations about what project goals are or how we're going to reach them, right? So when we think about project authority, we want to think about, what is the person's contribution, but also, how do we be honest about, where we're going as a team and why it matters for people to be invested in different ways. So for project management purposes, the complicating factor to all of this is that the more part-time staff or partners that you have, the more coordination that it requires. So oftentimes when I talk to people about project management, they look at project teams that are giant, 10, 12, 15, 20 people. And those projects looks super cool, right? Like we have these big giant meetings and people are awesome and you get to meet so many cool people. Those projects are incredible, but they take an incredible amount of coordination time. And so oftentimes when I talk to people about project teams and organizing project teams, one of the things I like to say to them is you want to divide your teams into groups so that you have fewer coordination points. So this team works on metadata and they meet on their own schedule. This team works on programming and they meet on their own schedule. This team works on UI UX and they work on their own schedule. And maybe we're only coordinating once a week on Slack or once a week in person or once a month in person, depending on the goals. And part of that's because a lot of times when you have part-time people or part-time projects, you have the split attention process, which is it takes cognitive processing time to switch between tasks, right? We all know this. Well, in digital humanities, when you may have lots of projects going on, it doesn't just take cognitive time to switch between tasks, it takes additional work, right? So I have to go find all my files. I have to get back up to speed on a project. So when you think about your goals for your project and how you organize it, you need to think about building in coordination time, right? So not just what are the phases of the project, but what are the moments when we're going to stop and coordinate and make sure we're all still working towards the same goals for the same reasons. And this is because, as I've learned repeatedly, no one project staff member can do anything or everything all the time. And that includes you. I used to make a joke, what happens if you get hit by a bus and can't continue on your project? I got hit by a car and was out by 3 months. I had to make sure everybody had access to my project materials, everybody had project access to my documentation. And so that's why we want to talk about and understand each other's roles and abilities, right? What happens if somebody has to take leave time? What happens if you need to take leave time? What's your fallback? What's your backup situation? And how do you sort of think about those things? And that could be as simple as this portion of the project isn't going to move forward until this person comes back. But it could also be, hey, I know a little something about metadata. Maybe I'll be doing the drafting. And then when the staff member who's a specialist in that comes back, they'll take a look at it and revise it and update it, right? So what are our options to include or to keep moving the project forward, even if someone is not available? So let's go back to our Padlet. What are the tools that we can use to help manage projects? What types of things could you do? What kind of things are out there that you can use to manage a project? Trello is a great one, and I'm going to show you that as an example. Asana is a great one. So these are all commercial tools that are out there that were developed for project management purposes. What other tools are available to help us manage projects? Google Sheets and spreadsheets. Slack's a great option for communication and posting. We'll talk a little bit about Slack. What about some low-tech tools? Special software like Gantt Project. Phones and live one-on-one conversations. Can you remember the last time you had a phone conversation or a phone call with someone? That's a great option. Coffee dates are great in non-COVID times, meeting one-on-one to have a conversation. Productive meetings. You should never go to a meeting that doesn't have an agenda. Can we talk about that for a moment? Project time is valuable time. So if you're going to go to a meeting, know what you're going for. Recording meetings are a great strategy so that if people can't attend, they can go back. I'm part of a lot of projects that record meetings, and part of what's also nice is we can go back and reconstruct the discussion. This is really important when there are concerns about something we may be doing and we want to go back and revisit what those concerns were. Planio and Redmine for ticketing, right? So this is a to-do that you need to do, and you assign it to someone and get it to go. All right, yes to an agenda. Yes to an agenda. Do not attend meetings that don't have agendas. Bad idea. All right, so let's take a look at some tools that are available. So this is Trello, which was mentioned. So these are just screenshots of general use. So you can see we have, inboxes, you've got a backlog list, things that need to be fixed. You've got some in progress, blocked pauses. Each of those round dots are people being assigned. You can like it. You've got calendars so that you can assign due dates. You can assign reminders. These are really great if you're a visual type learner who likes to see progress. Part of the reason why I like Trello is because they've got tons and tons of different types of templates for different things, including events. So it can sort of pre-populate how you might organize your world and your life. Here's an example. This is Asana. So this is one where the project was built using sort of like a planning stage, a milestone stage, and a next steps. And you can see that you have sort of a simple graphic. What is the priority of this task? Is it low, medium, high? Where is the task at? Is it, done? Is it in progress? Is it on hold? It can even, one of the things I like about the task project is you can say, it's going to be reassigned. And you can see the little icon to see who's responsible or whose stop is that at. One of the nice things about Asana is really the sort of simplicity of it, right? It's something that's very quick to look at and you know where you're at any given moment. And Basecamp is similar to these. Basecamp's very popular. Basecamp comes with a chat function and a message board function. You have to-dos and assignment lists that you can do as templates. You get automatic check-ins, which is great. You can set it to remind you automatically that something is due. And part of what I like about the sort of Basecamp option is that you can actually copy and paste Basecamp templates across projects. So for example, I have a metadata template that has a list of 22 steps we do for metadata building. I can just copy and paste that over between projects. Same thing with documentation and reporting. I have like an NEH template that I can use, and I can just copy across Shirk or NEH so that I know what all the things are that are due, and I can just make sure all of those things are automatically included. This is Slack. So most people are familiar with Slack. One of the benefits to Slack is that you can do tons and tons of different channels. So a lot of times what I have is, I not only have a Slack for the major project that I'm on, like we have a HILT Slack that we use, but I can also have channels inside of that, right? So I can have a catering channel, and I can have a coordination channel, and I can have a instructor channel. And the benefit to Slack is, you can assign things, you can pin things, you can remind things, but also it works across all of your devices, which is part of what I really like about Slack, is that I can have it on my cell phone so that when I've got downtime in between meetings, I don't have to, pull out my computer and check on things. It's just a lovely tool. Importantly though, and this is one of the major things that matters when it comes to technologies for managing projects, this is a saying from Confucius: do not use a cannon to kill a mosquito. One of the most frustrating things for me as a project manager is that people think they need really complicated technology to manage a project. 9 times out of 10, my projects start like this. Post-its. This is a Kanban board. So you'll see there's a backlog category. There's a things I'm working on category with like, I'm kind of thinking about it. I'm doing a little bit. I'm not, I'm doing a lot, versus like this thing I'm actually working on today. And these are the things that are done. I love project planning with Post-its because you can not only move those Post-its around, but if you're working as a team, everybody can bring their Post-its to the table, right? And you get a very quick sense of what other people consider the work of the project. So for example, this is what is the spreadsheet version of a Post-it setup that Rupika Rasam and I developed for our special issues for reviews in digital humanities. So what you can see is, each column has sort of a header, but inside the header, we have very specific things that we do to move through our special issue process. So every special issue starts with a review editor, who's the special issue, what do they want to do? We identify those projects. We then have to communicate with the project directors. They identify reviewers. We get overviews from project directors. We get, different due dates for those things. They have to be approved. Each of those Post-its becomes a category, and then we can use this particular spreadsheet over and over and over again. So if you see at the bottom of the screen, there are tabs for each of the special issues that we're working on right now, and we basically just copy the spreadsheet across. Part of the joy of Post-its, like this set, is that it becomes a way for you guys to renegotiate a project as it's going on, right? So a lot of times my Post-its will come off of the board and be set aside. And when we have free time on a project, we'll go back and look at those Post-its that have been set aside. Maybe we decided not to prioritize building a type of teaching module. Well, we've got an extra 20 hours this week or this month. Let's go back and revisit doing that. So let's talk about it again. Let's pull that Post-it back out and take a look at it. And you can color code Post-its, which is always fun. I love Post-it planning for projects. And again, the other thing that's nice when you move to the spreadsheet option, spreadsheets are easy to share, they're easy to be copied, they're easy to be forwarded. And I'm a spreadsheet user, obviously, and absolutely adore spreadsheets. So let's go back to the Padlet for one final time in terms of the presentation. What are the biggest challenges that we might face when managing a project? What do you think the things are that just sort of stick in your craw when you're involved in a project? Version control. Wrong person's on the project for sure. Communication. Momentum. Yep. What do we do when projects stall? What do we do when people or projects themselves are not accountable? Momentum for sure. Not enough lead time. What do we do when a project drifts? A lack of a skill. Getting everyone to use the same tools. All right, let's start with getting everyone to use the same tools, valuing everybody, disagreements. Okay, using the same tools. One of the reasons why I say don't, use a cannon to kill a mosquito is that oftentimes what happens is people want to use the cool tool or develop a cool tool. They don't want to use something out of the box. The problem with that approach is if it's not something that you already use in your day-to-day, it can become very difficult to incorporate yet another tool or yet another project management sort of setup into your day-to-day life. So when we talk about, sort of setting up the technical parameters of a project, one of the more important conversations to have is, you might like to do this and I might like to do that. We need to compromise on what we're going to do together. And that's that kind of question about, communication. When you think about a project, it's not you by yourself. You're working as a team. And so you have to be willing to compromise. I'm not a fan of excessive conversation. I like things that are very targeted and very like goal driven. I have to be willing to compromise in our project conversations that we may have a meeting where we spend an hour discussing something we've already discussed before because we haven't quite reached comfortability or consensus on that particular topic. For me personally, that drives me nuts, but that can be a very useful conversation for other people on the team. And so I need to understand that, and I need to sort of sit back and say, it's okay that we're covering ground we've already covered before, because ultimately it will help us all move in the same direction at the same time. And that goes to that question of scientific disagreements. What do you do when you just don't agree? And sometimes not agreeing isn't just about like not agreeing on a tool or an approach. It can be, we don't actually agree on what the goal of the project is. So one of the examples for this, for me, is the question of who does a project serve? I get very uncomfortable when a project only serves the people that are in the room, right? Like if this is just a project for the 5 of us or the 6 of us or the 10 of us, and we don't really think we're going to serve a community, or we don't really think we're going to serve an audience outside of this room, what are we doing this for? And some of the most uncomfortable conversations as academics can be, we don't agree on what we're going to be doing and why. So a couple of strategies to address this. One of the things that you can do is you can sit down and you can say, I need each of us to come to the table with a written statement of what we think this project is about and for. And the reason why I say a written statement is a lot of times in conversations where you disagree, people find their emotions getting very heightened and they get very frustrated. By asking people to come early with things written down, part of what you can do is you can put all of those things together in the middle of the table and you can shuffle them up and have one person read all of them to the room. And that can take the pressure off people from being the person who disagrees, but it can also allow you to raise things as a community rather than placing the onus on an individual or 2 people to argue with one another. And one of the strategies that goes with this is when you're disagreeing to say, let's go ahead and we're going to step back for a moment. This is what we think this disagreement is about. Is it actually a disagreement about where the project is going, or is there something else underlying it? Sometimes it's personality. Sometimes it's that trust has dissolved, right? So maybe you have somebody who shows up to meeting late and is, never reading the material and is never prepared. That breaks trust in a project team when it feels like someone doesn't care about the project at the same level the rest of the team does. And rather than, sitting down and saying, we feel like you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, one strategy to use is to sit down and say, let's review what the agreements are for this project. We as a team agreed to show up in person on time. We agreed to be prepared. Do we collectively feel like that's happening? Well, probably not. Okay, so why is that not happening? Maybe it's that person has something going on personally. Maybe it's that they're overwhelmed. That then becomes the conversation. How do we deal with being overwhelmed? Sometimes it's even as simple as we're going to start every meeting for the first 5 minutes where everyone says one thing that they feel overwhelmed by and one way they think they can fix it or address it. Or maybe it's we spend 5 minutes talking about what happened personally to us in the week so that we sort of have a moment to release that energy before we get started. And that goes to valuing every team member. One of the things that's a real struggle, particularly in academic context, is that there's such a variety of ranks in the room, right? You can have untenured and tenured and students and staff, and you can have senior and junior and temporary and permanent workers. And oftentimes it can be difficult to negotiate how everyone feels at any given moment. One of the strategies that I find really useful when it comes to valuing every team member, when we build our projects, we actually sit down on a regular basis and say, what do you feel you're contributing well? What do you feel like you could improve on? And what do you think you need help on to do better? And one of the strategies for that, what that allows us to do, particularly with people who are junior, is it raises things in a very non-confrontational way where they can say things like, I don't like the fact that I get asked to get coffee in meetings, or I think it's a problem that senior people don't call junior people by their names, right? And this doesn't have to be done in a way that's, open and public. This can be one-on-one meetings. These can even be anonymous surveys, right? These are things that allow us to say, I want you to have a positive and productive working environment, and I want you to feel valued in a way that matters to you. And when we hire new people or bring new people onto a project, that's actually a really great conversation to have. How do you feel valued as an employee? For me, I love money, don't get me wrong. I would love to get a raise constantly. But the reality is, I really like when somebody says, you did really well on that. I like positive affirmation. I like a short note. I like a post-it. I like a you did well. When someone says that to me, then I feel empowered as a staff member or as a worker. And then I want to spend more time working on that project and contribute even more. Part of what that does when you establish, what value somebody wants or how they want to be valued in a project, is it also allows you to do things like identify when somebody doesn't have a skill. And that sort of assessment of what do you think you're not doing well allows you to have a conversation about what does it mean if somebody thought they had a skill that they don't. And this happens a lot in projects where, somebody can think they have a technical ability or could learn to do something technically that they may not be able to, or, they think that they have a really great idea visually or spatially for something or a UX design. But the reality is that may not be the best decision for the project as a whole. So one of the challenges that we sort of have to address is how do you have a conversation with somebody where you say, I know you're invested in this, but you may not be the right person to lead this area anymore. So there's two ways to have the conversation. One way is to sit down and say, how do you as person X, feel this thing is going? Do you think it's going well? Do you think it's going poorly? And one of the things I like to do with people is to say, okay, we think it's going this way. You think it's going that way. What are some concrete steps we can do together? So maybe it's that I meet with you. Maybe it's that we subsidize you getting some additional training. Maybe it's that we bring on a partner who has that skill and they mentor you in this. And this is one of the greatest things about digital humanities is that there are so many skills you can learn. And bringing in a partner who has that skill is an opportunity to grow as a person. It's an opportunity to learn from people, and it's an opportunity to admit that, like, I thought I was good at something and I actually may not be as great as I want to be. So I'm going to spend some time and learn these things. And it's important for us when we think about this particular skill that we address the fact that that needs to come with time and money. Don't ask someone to learn something outside of their skill set unless you're going to provide a supportive structure for them to do that, right? And that goes to that question about the wrong person on the project. Think about when you have those conversations, if it's clear that the person is just banging their head up against a wall and may not get there, it is better and more humane to say, this is not working and we need to sit down and adjust the project. So maybe it's somebody being reassigned, maybe it's somebody doing something new and different. And that goes to that question of version control, right? People are versions as well. And part of these conversations is identifying, can this particular person do this, or do we need a new version, a new person to do this type of work? So let's flip back to our keynote. So what do we do when projects attack? When delays happen, this is that project creep post that somebody made for us. We want to set hard deadlines. This thing is due then. And we want to decide, what do we actually have to move forward? A lot of times when we talk about projects, we have written agreements of what we're going to do or what we have to deliver. And then as projects develop, we get lots and lots and lots of things that we kind of want to do, right? So I agree to build a pedagogy, a syllabus, and I decide I also want to build some lectures and I want to build some rubrics. Well, the reality is I only agreed to build a syllabus. So I need to prioritize that. So one of the strategies for this, for projects as much as possible, I actually like to have on our Trello board or our Basecamp or our Post-its or on the wall in our office, what our actual deliverables are for a project that we've all agreed to. and make sure if anything is added to that, that is added in a different space so that we know later if we have to cut out some work, what gets cut out. And by that, I mean, you want to use your power. When you manage a project, your job sometimes is to say no. And my favorite example of this is I was managing a project that was a literary edition a few years ago, where the person that was the most senior on the project was a specialist in that particular project. And it felt like every meeting they came in and said, oh, I had a great idea. I want to do X and Y. I had a great idea. Let's do A, B, and C. And by the time the first month was over, we had a project that had had 2 deliverables end up with 11. And so how that conversation then occurred was I brought that person in, we sat down and had a meeting, and I said, we have money to do this thing we agreed to, these first 2 things. How are you going to fund all of these other things? Or how are you going to find staff for all of these other things? And part of that for me is using your power as an individual. When somebody comes to me and says they want to add new things to my project or new things to my to-do list, I give them a list of the things that are already on it that they've agreed to and say, which thing would you like me to stop doing? And oftentimes that's how I get to say no without saying no in a way that's mean or rude. So would you like me to add this new thing? Great. What of these other 3 things you're having me doing am I no longer going to be doing? And if they continue to add, I continue to take things off. So at the end of the day, I have a balanced workload. So what do you do when you don't have enough money? Be upfront about what you actually can do. Which deliverables will have the most impact or that are the most important to you as a team? Those are your primary goals. And don't delay in how to save money. So someone had identified thrift as one of the skills. A lot of times figuring out, what's the base level of what we can do versus what's the luxury version, right? So a lot of times the base level for me is, we put it up on Slack, or we put it up, on GitHub, we put it up on the internet, and it's, the not pretty version of our documentation. Maybe it's not as organized as I want it to be, or maybe it doesn't include all the things that it needs to, but it does get the job done. And so a lot of times when you line out your goals, you can line out, this is the bare minimum of what we have to do. This is the luxury version that if we have extra time and energy and money, we can do those things. So how do we deal with that issue of that wrong person, or when a team member or a project group is unsuccessful? There are a couple of really quick questions to ask. Is it a personality thing? Is this a clash of the titans in terms of how people like to work? I was on a project a few years ago where it was just clear that 2 people couldn't communicate with each other in a way that was productive. They just, for some reason, were unable to hear each other when they talked. So that conversation with them was, it's clear it's not productive. So what we're going to do? We're going to kind of split the project in 2, and you're going to handle this half, and you're going to handle this half. That can be a strategy. The other strategy is also to bring them in and say, hey, I understand that you guys aren't working well together, but what you're doing is causing a problem for the team as a whole, and I need you to fix it. I need you to talk to each other and address this because it's impacting how this project is going. The personality thing is a little bit different from knowledge, right? Like knowledge takes time and effort to acquire. Personality sometimes can be changed or addressed, and sometimes it can't. So it's important when somebody's unsuccessful to play to their strengths, right? And that goes back to the beginning of the talk about how do we assess what skills we need. Being honest with people about what they can do and what they want to do and where they want to spend their time is one of the most important project management skills. Asking somebody who's not well organized to organize an event may not be your best option. Because of this, you never want to assume that you understand what is going on with someone else, right? Like personal lives happen, private lives happen, and no one is obligated to tell you what's going on with that. What you want to make sure to do, though, is to just say, it seems like you're struggling and it's impacting your work. Is there anything we can do to help you within the boundaries of what we can do? And maybe it's shifting your workload. Maybe it's moving around some deadlines. Maybe it's just being honest with people in a meeting and saying, I'm not prepared today. Can we do this tomorrow? Some strategies to help when people are unsuccessful, offer training, offer an opportunity to discuss, and ultimately you've got to draw a firm line in the sand. People matter on projects, but you also have people you're responsible to, including funders, and you really do want to draw that firm line in the sand. What do you do when the person above you is the problem on a project? I am so busy, important, overworked, uninterested. Be clear that time is money and that everyone is valuable. One of the most important defenses you can make of a team is to identify who the most junior or most vulnerable people are in the room and make sure that their working conditions are the ones that matter. If you see something that someone is doing that's impacting a team member poorly or is inconsiderate or is not appropriate, pull them aside and call out that behavior. You want to sort of embody the values of a project in a positive way, and holding people accountable is one of the ways you do that. With senior people in particular, being clear that without their support, a project can't move forward. Play to their vanity if you need to. But also, you can't reconfigure an entire project and an entire team just because they have an issue. Particularly with senior people, they like to, throw some things in the ground, like, we need you to do this immediately. And their immediately may not actually be the thing that's most important to the project, right? So, being honest, even when it's difficult, and saying, I understand that this is a priority. We can't get to it now. We can get to this in a week. If you'd like to get to it now, feel free. And those can be quite uncomfortable conversations to have, but unfortunately, they kind of have to be had. So what do you do when you have these problems? Document your deliverables or the lack thereof. If someone doesn't follow through with something they said they're going to do, make sure you document that. Make sure you document that you tried to address it, right? So with advisors in particular, all right, hopefully you're still there. Are you still there?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry, my screen just went completely blank. Document your attempts to meet and discuss, right? So keep copies of those emails, write a formal letter of request. One of the other strategies you can use is actually do nothing. Let someone fail. Sometimes managing projects means letting people fail, and that's okay. We're apparently having technical issues at the moment. Okay. Sorry, apparently my computer's just decided to lose its mind. Okay. When failure is uncomfortable, the other choice you have here is to, slow play the project, right? So I like to build in as much as possible extra time in a project where if something goes wrong, we can fix it, right? So maybe it's moving up a phase of a project. Like, we thought we were going to start work on this technical thing in 3 months. We're actually going to start it now. Or we thought we were going to do an event in January. We're actually going to move it back to March. When you have these types of delays, one of the most important things, though, is to be honest with people about that change in timeline, and also talk to people about the staff and the resources that they're going to have access to. So when you document, discuss, and attempt to sort of revise, making sure everyone stays on the same page when it comes to those revisions. What do you do when you're the problem? So I've been the problem on a project. I think everybody's been a problem on a project. You need to be honest with yourself that you're the problem, and let somebody around you talk to you about it, right? Don't be defensive if you're struggling. Sometimes it means being clear that you're no longer useful to the project, right? So it could be stepping aside. It could be saying, I'm not in a space where I'm very good with what's going on, so I need to step aside and we're going to find somebody else. You've got to be honest. What are the problems and issues you're having, and what would solve that for you as a person? And sometimes the solution can be, I need a couple of days off, or I need to go take care of this other thing, and then I can come back and deal with this. Part of this is being honest as a team. Do you really believe in the project and acting accordingly, right? Particularly with projects that last over time, there are moments when your attention is divided or you're distracted. Be honest about those things. And if you have a problem with someone or with the project, don't let it fester. When problems fester is when projects get into trouble. Projects are like children. They need guidance, enjoyment, trust, faith, and a clear goal. Your job in project management is to make sure the project stays alive and moving forward, or your job is to be the merciful person who ends it, right? Who comes in and brings in the whole team and says, we have made no progress in months. It's clear that everybody doesn't care about this anymore. We need to dissolve the project. And that's where that project charter that we started with can be handy, is to have a section in your project charter that says, what do we do if the project fails? What do we do if we need to dissolve what we're doing? Sometimes when you think about your project, what you really need is a swift kick in the butt. And sometimes what that means is communicating clearly that everybody needs a swift kick in the butt by recommitting to the project. So all of the things that I've talked about today are covered in devdh.org. Devdh.org is a project management site that Simon Appleford and I built. It is dozens and dozens of lectures and slide decks and templates and example grants. There's all kinds of resources here. There's all kinds of downloads. If there's not something here that you need or want, you can totally email me. I am happy to build new things. We're in the process of revising this, but it's a great resource when you're thinking about problems or issues in digital humanities. So with the few minutes that we have left, I'm going to switch back to our Padlet and ask you, what do you need help with when it comes to project management that I haven't covered? You know, what are issues or problems or scenarios or just merely questions you have about project management and the digital humanities that you need help with? Because that's what this is for. I want to make sure you guys walk away with this feeling like you learned something useful or got help.
This is probably a great time for me to ask the question that came in the chat. It actually applied to many things that you were saying, but what happens when you have less techie team members who have different personalities and hardware, etc., and don't want to use some of the tools like Slack, Trello, Google Sheets, so buy into tools or technical skills to use their skills?
So it depends on the situation. So when it's a paid project, oftentimes what we'll do as a team is sit down and say, here's the deal. I realize that you don't want to use Slack, or you don't want to use email, or you don't want to use whatever. That's not feasible for this as a project. So what we'll do is we'll set up time check-ins. So for example, we'll start every morning as a group together at 9:15 and we'll have a Zoom call, and Slack will be open and we will check in at 9:15 and everyone will agree to check back in at 4:45, right? So sometimes with the technical hesitancy, I get it, but at the same time, this is your job and you're being paid to do it. So it's not that I'm going to say you have to have it open 8 hours a day or you have to commit to using it 100% of the time, but I'm going to say you have to report on your check-ins with us at 9 o'clock or 9:15 or at 4:45 or whatever. When it comes to things that aren't like Slack or Basecamp or Trello, but are things like, I don't want to use GitHub or I don't want to use this repository, again, at the end of the day, we're here to work towards the positive part of the project. And a lot of times in that project charter and consensus discussion at the beginning, we're going to make a decision about majority rules or most senior person makes these decisions. Sometimes in these conversations, one of the things to think about is how many projects do you have running at the same time? I encourage people who manage multiple projects to try and have all the projects managed using the same technology. So if I have a programmer, we try and use GitHub and Slack for all of our programming tasks. Or if I, am managing 3 or 4 or 5 different projects at a center, we have a suite of tools that we have agreed to use. And we say to people when they come to work with us, these are the tools that we use. That works really well when it's like a campus-based project. It can get a little bit more difficult when it's an international project because there are different rules around certain tools. But again, that's where choosing to go low tech might be really useful. So using a spreadsheet or using email, and one person's job in the project may be, the programmers report in every morning by email, and there may be a graduate student or a project manager who takes those emails and puts them into Slack or puts them into Trello for the team. Does that help answer that question? Okay, Being given responsibilities without authority. So one of the things that I think is really hard sometimes is that when you're given responsibilities without any of the authority, there's not a real sense of who is the person who has the authority. So for example, I am responsible for setting up a talk, or I'm responsible for managing, a big giant multi-million-dollar project, but I'm not actually the person whose name is on the project, or I'm not actually the person who can call around and get people to do things. There's a couple of different strategies to deal with this. One strategy is in the name of. I use this a lot with projects where I'm managing very senior people or managing multi-institutional collaborations where I might not be the person people want to listen to. I will start my email by saying, hi, I'm writing on behalf of so-and-so, who is the PI of this project. And I CC them on that email. That's one way of using authority by proxy to get responses from people. I also have an escalating schema for authority. So the first time I deal with you and I'm given a responsibility and I can't get anywhere, that's fine. The second time I'm going to CC someone. The third time I'm going to call someone. The fourth time we're going to be meeting in person. When it's you being given responsibilities that you don't think are appropriate for you because you don't have the authority, that's where that sort of set of honest conversations, like, you've asked me to be in charge of this particular thing, but no one will listen to me and no one agrees with me. One strategy to address that is to have a group meeting with the people that are involved where the person who is in charge says, I have delegated responsibility to this task to this particular person. And I expect when they ask you to do things, you do things as if I'm the one asking you, right? And this is a management strategy that gets used all the time in business is to sort of have a conversation where delegation is made readily clear to everyone in the room. You should also feel clear, though, if you are given responsibility and no authority and you feel like that's going to make you fail, you've got to say that. You've got to come out and say, you've given me this set of tasks to do and no authority to do this, and I feel like you're setting me up for failure. So what are the things you are going to help me do or give me that will allow me to succeed? So instead of it being your problem, you make it your boss's problem. You tell them you need their help and that they have to help you. And that again becomes something you document so that if they don't help you and you fail, you can say, well, 7 months ago, I came to you and said, I needed your assistance on these things and you didn't do it. So I don't know where to go with this, right? So sometimes it's about, covering your own rear end. Balancing between listening to the project team and keeping them on track. So there's a couple of strategies in terms of balancing, keeping them on track. A lot of people use daily meetings. Let's start by saying what we've accomplished. Let's start by saying what we're working on. I personally like to mix between one-on-one conversations or coffees or Zoom meetings where I say, hey, I'm just checking in with you for 5 minutes. How do you feel like you're coming along? Or you might be a little behind. What can we do to help? A lot of times with people, when we're doing the balancing act, asking what do you need to succeed can be a really good way to intervene and get people back on track. So it may be, I'll agree that the 3 things you're working on, this one is the important one that I need you to focus on, and we're going to set the other 2 aside until you're done with that. It can also, though, be a conversation where, making other people aware on the team of what other people are doing is really important. Sometimes in projects, you get teams where because everybody's working so privately and individually, there's a sense that maybe other people aren't doing their jobs or aren't working. And so, this is why like Trello boards and base camps and Post-its, this way people can see it may seem like, Sam is sitting in the corner not doing anything, but Sam's actually, working really hard on what he's doing. And so a lot of times at the end of the week, we'll talk about, what successes we've had as a team or what people successfully worked on that week. And that's a way to keep the team on track, but also a subtle way to pressure people who maybe aren't on track. Hey, you've reported on the same thing for 2 or 3 conversations. What is it that's holding you back? What can we do? And if the holding back happens over weeks, maybe that's when we have a conversation about the task being reassigned to someone else. In international collaborative projects, we see members from different scientific work cultures. How can we manage these differences in an optimal way? Yeah, one of my first projects was a 5-country collaboration across multiple continents. And it was eye-opening for me how different work cultures were between, for example, the UK and the US and the UK and Africa. And one of the things that I think is really important is to have a sit down individually with each sort of partner or each group in their country, and to ask, how do you guys want to be worked with? So for example, in a recent collaboration, I sat down with a team in Australia and said, it would help me to understand, how do you guys work best as a team? How frequently do you want to check in? How frequently do you want to hear from us? And sort of having those setup conversations are really important, because this way, I know not to bother you guys when it comes to certain things, right? So maybe they don't want daily emails or daily Slacks. Maybe they just want to be able to check in once a week. Part of that too is also raising issues around timing. A lot of times when there's conflict between work cultures, it can be as a result of time zones. Being aware that asking somebody at 5 a.m. in California time to have a conversation with somebody who's at midnight in Europe is maybe not the kindest thing, right? So when you think about international collaborations, you may need to think about more asynchronous work than synchronous work, just because you're spread out across so many time zones. And maybe that's, recording meetings, maybe that's pre-recording things. Being aware of time zones can be a really important way to encourage collaboration and responsibility. How do we manage our own emotions, especially feeling underappreciated? Emotions are hard, really hard sometimes, not just when you feel undervalued and underappreciated, but I think there's a lot of gender and racial biases when it comes to project work, where people read into how you respond emotionally or not. So when it comes to managing emotions, for me personally, I think one of the things that I do that helps a lot is I tend to not emote for a really long period of time. And then it's like I save it all up and then I lose my mind, right? I let it all go in a way that's probably not appropriate or not useful. So one of the things that I do that has helped me a lot in managing feeling underappreciated is to say to people, when you say X, I feel like you don't value me, or, when you don't show up on time, I understand you're busy, but that makes me feel like you don't care about the project we're working on. Writing down your emotions, writing down how you feel about something, getting it out on a piece of paper can be very cathartic. And those pieces of paper collectively and cumulatively can become something that you put together in, a statement that you might read to your boss. Hey, I want to talk to you about how I feel. You may not realize it, but when you talk to me, a lot of times the tone that you have, you're not paying attention to me, or you're treating me I feel like you're treating me different than everybody else. The way of sort of talking to people that way, it takes some of the sort of burden off of you having thoughts in the moment and allows you to sort of say, this is what I think and this is what I feel. I think when it comes to managing emotions, it's important to be honest with people, but it's also important to protect yourself. So when I talk to people about how I feel about things, oftentimes, particularly when people are talking to me about how they feel, asking, what can we do to help you feel more secure? What can we do to help you feel more appreciated? Having a strategy where you don't just say, you're making me feel bad, where you say, to help me feel better, I need you to do X, Y, or Z, or I need you to speak to me this way or that way, can really help. I think sometimes we think everybody has the same level of emotional maturity. And as a boss, if an employee is struggling, I may not know how to deal with that. So the more guidance you can give to somebody about how you want to be treated, I think the better things work in a project environment. What to do about jealousy among team members? Yeah. So jealousy is really hard. There's a couple of different strategies. One is when it's happening between people and it happens with the same people a lot, I oftentimes will pull them aside individually first and say, hey, I noticed when so-and-so said something, you seemed a little upset, or you seemed like, you weren't real happy about what they were achieved. What's going on? Are you okay? Making people aware that you see that emotion happening for them, I think is important. Once I've had those individual conversations, bringing them in together, like if it's clear that the jealousy is causing a group dynamic issue between the two people, bringing them in together and saying, listen, I'm a little concerned because it feels like, there's friction here, and that rather than feeling like you guys are working together, it seems like you guys are trying to work against each other, and maybe you're just unsettled about something, putting it in the phrase, not of like, we need you to do something, but like, as your boss or as your team member or as the team leader, as a project manager, I need to be able to help you. What can I do to help you guys feel more comfortable or to resolve this? Sometimes just letting people air their feelings will resolve it. But sometimes it does take actual action, right? So sometimes the jealousy can be as simple as that person's always the first person to be called on in a meeting, or, you always ask that person to go give the talk. And so a lot of times as a manager or as an employee running a project, I try to take notes and like rotate things around. Like if I've asked so-and-so to lead the meeting this day, I need to ask so-and-so, this other person, the next day. Or, maybe this person won an award for something on the project. One of the things we'll do is celebrate that award, but then the next conversation will be, okay, so you've done this really great thing. Can you tell us how you did that so that everybody else learns about it and has an opportunity to now go learn how to do that and achieve, right? So spreading out resources, spreading out these support mechanisms can really help with jealousy. The other thing that helps with jealousy is having an honest conversation about what somebody cares about in their career. And this is just a general thing. I'm really shocked in the academy that we don't talk as much about where people want to go in their career. What do you want to be doing in a year, 5 years, 10 years? And in projects in particular, asking people what skills or what things do you want to develop? Where do you want to go next, right? Maybe they want to be a team leader. Maybe they want to, run a group. Maybe they want to go run a research center. Asking those questions can be really revealing because it allows you to restructure a project so the person gets experience doing those things. Sometimes jealousy is not just about like, this person got this opportunity, but it can also be about, I'm feeling stuck in my job and I don't know where I want to go. And so having a conversation with somebody where there's a little bit of career conversation can really help, because it allows me as an employer to say, oh, I know that Sarah really wants to learn how to code. So maybe in this project, I'm going to ask, our senior coder to work with her and give her an assignment on the project so that she gets some experience and she learns, but also we get a sense from her that she's moving forward in her career. And I think, a lot of times jealousy is internal to a person and you can't fix it, but you can help ameliorate the outside factors that are contributing to it. Even just by saying, hey, I appreciate you. And I know you may feel like, this other person's getting attention, but I promise, that's not, I see what you're contributing and it's fabulous and lovely and great. So I think those are all the questions from the Padlet. Are there any other things when it comes to project management as we run out of time that you really need help with? And again, I'm here to answer questions on email or on Twitter anytime. I'm happy to help. I've been doing this for a while and I know lots of people who project manage. So I feel like a lot of these scenarios that you guys have raised and a lot of these answers and questions you have are so common and are so important to talk about and get answers to.
I just want to thank you so much, Jen. This was really great. Towards the start of the session, Sarah Simpkin and I were messaging each other about how many rules we broke. Writing our DH workshops chapter on Thanksgiving weekend.
Yep.
But I like so many of these tips aren't just technical, they're human resource type tips, but also, where we ended with sort of managing emotions,
Yeah.
which is probably the hardest one out of all of this because we all feel deeply and differently, and express it in so many different
Yeah.
ways. So thank you so much. I see one question.
Sure.
Just thank
Sure.
you. Fantastic
Oh,
presentation.
lovely. And
Uh,
again, I'm here if you guys have other questions. Like I was saying, it's hard in these situations because when you're in them,
they feel so overwhelming, and you're like, oh my God, I'm freaking out. How do I deal with this? This is where asking people like myself or Jada or Sarah or Laura or Simon or, other people in the network, like, how do you deal with this, or how do you encounter this, can be really helpful, because your strategy may be different from somebody else's. So the more you ask questions, the more you ask for help, the better your projects will be, I swear.
And sometimes that other person sees it differently than you do and will have a different perspective that you can't see because you're in it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, my go-to emotion is frustration. So inevitably I'm like, am I overreacting? Yes. The answer is yes. Like, take a walk, come back in 20 minutes, you'll be better.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think you're going to enjoy all the tweets that have been happening about this session. And thank you everybody who joined us today, who participated with the Padlet on Twitter. We do have one final question. If you have any good tools, methods for documenting decisions and
Yes. Are you still there? Okay. Yes. So Julia Flanders and Trevor Munoz developed a resource for data sharing. I will share it on Twitter for you guys for documenting decisions and sustainability.
well, thank you again. Thanks to our participants, and apologies if I'm getting a little choppy. And I guess I would just say that we'll be announcing the winter term sessions soon. So keep your eye on Twitter. And if you're not on the DH mailing list, check us out at dhsite.org and sign up so you can receive those messages in December and in January. And have a wonderful end of term, exam, holiday season. I hope everyone has time to recharge before January. Thank you again, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jada.